Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.
This week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, the Supreme Court hears oral arguments over the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program. Lori Lightfoot, mayor of Chicago, loses her bid for re-election, becoming the first Chicago mayor in 40 years to do so. And the House Subcommittee on China holds its first meeting on China's wishes for Taiwan, COVID from a Chinese lab, and they're partnering with Russia. I'm André Laborde. We've got these stories and more. It's Friday. That means it's time for Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, I'm André Laborde. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. It's Friday, March 3rd, 2023. Well, this week, the House held its first hearing on the newly created House Subcommittee on China, and they held it prime time. What perfect timing, because my guest tonight will be author and founder of the Atlas Organization, Jonathan Ward. He's the founder of the Atlas Organization, and that's a strategy consultant company advising many Fortune 500 companies on U.S. and China relations. He's also the author of the new book, The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. Well, that book is forwarded by Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He's retired, but he's also the former U.S. National Security Advisor. Well, this week, the House Subcommittee on China held its first meeting, and their first witness was Lieutenant General McMaster, who forwarded Jonathan's latest book. Well, that book is called The Decisive Decade, and he's been a consultant to Fortune 500 companies on China and India, and he's here with us tonight. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Hi, Andre. Great to be with you, and great to be here in New Orleans, where I'm speaking to pension funds and endowments. It's a wonderful city. So,
Jonathan, many of our viewers might remember the 1960s and 70s with the Cold War we've had with Russia. Are we now in a new Cold War but now with China?
well, Andre, I think that is the best historical analogy. I mean, we're coming to terms with the fact that we're in a global competition with a hostile totalitarian power. China has had very long-standing plans and strategies to ultimately become the dominant superpower. They call that the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese Nation. That was the subject of my first book, China's Vision of Victory. And it's a global strategy. It involves becoming the dominant economic power and the dominant military power in the world. So in that sense, it's very similar to the USSR, global in scope, hostile when it comes to both ideology and military power. And we are just getting into the game and just realizing that this is what's going on.
I've been told that China refers to, because you used the word hostile, and that was interesting because I've heard where China refers to us and Xi Jinping as the enemy. Do they know that we are in a Cold War, but we don't know we're in a Cold War?
Well, Andre, I think they're the ones that have instigated this entire thing. And we have to remember that the U.S. strategy towards China, in the post-Cold War period from the 90s onwards, and even in the latter parts of the Cold War, was all about engagement. It was to, initially treat them as a partner in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, but then ultimately to form trade ties and economic relations in such a way that we expected them to become a kind of economic partner to us, and a responsible stakeholder was the word that policymakers used. That they would become part of what created security around the world. And instead, what was really going on was that they were using American engagement to build themselves up, to sort of exit their period of being a largely agrarian economy and to become a military and technological superpower. And at this point, to become the preeminent piece of the global trading system, the preeminent manufacturing power. These are all things that we gave away through engagement. And we didn't have a clear idea of what they wanted, but they sure did. And the fact that we're now starting to get the picture. You can see the hostility in their rhetoric and actions, and we can go through plenty of that today. But it's really, it's quite serious.
I'll use the term balloons, although our government has been many times talking about, quote, objects that have been shot down from the sky. If given that the other objects that have been shot down were from China, which I'm assuming they were, do you think that they were actually using these balloons to for espionage and spy, or do you think it was a test to see what our reactions would be when we had a foreign object flying over our own mainland?
So China is conducting surveillance apparently against military assets, not only of the United States, but many of our most important allies. So and then when you look at the fact that, of course, we took this thing down, and this was, I think, the first time that we've seen wall-to-wall China coverage in America, the first time that the nature of this regime and its actions became sort of a household dinner table conversation in our country. In my whole career of talking about these issues and working on these issues, I think we've never seen a moment such as the one where America gets to realize that this balloon is part of us dealing with a hostile power, and it's now commonly understood, I think. But then the reaction of the Chinese Foreign Ministry to us shooting down the balloon, and this happened this week, was to say that China is strongly opposed to this and will take countermeasures against relevant U.S. entities that have undermined our sovereignty and security to firmly safeguard our sovereignty and legitimate rights and interests. So their response to us shooting down their spy balloon is to essentially say that we've violated their legitimate rights and interests. So I mean, that shows you the nature of this diplomatic relationship. It's hostile. I mean, this is a place that seeks to surpass us, supplant us, undermine us, and break apart the American-led order. And they're conducting that. They're building a military that is, very clearly designed for combat with the United States. They have harassing, our allies in the region. Fentanyl is coming into the United States without any, sort of mitigation efforts from the People's Republic of China, and killing tens of thousands of Americans, and the intellectual property theft and transfer that has enabled them to become a technological superpower that they're now converting into military power. I mean, it's quite a bad situation. So, we have to get busy realizing that, sort of engagement and sort of the diplomatic protocols of dealing with them are probably not going to yield the results that we want.
Our U-2 spy planes have been in existence for over a good 60 years. I mean, France's Gary Powers was shot down spying for us over the Russian USSR back in 1960. Is their version, are they technological, they meaning China, are they technologically advanced with an equivalent of a U-2 spy plane? And I ask this question because a balloon is slower, it's lower altitude. Now, maybe because it is slower, they can take better pictures, possibly, but or was it just to see our reactions on how would we react to having a foreign object fly over our own mainland?
Well, right. My understanding of it is that the advantages to a balloon like this for surveillance is that it can loiter over, the targets that it seeks to surveil for hours as opposed to minutes like a satellite. So a satellite, of course, goes around and is able to take pictures, but not to hover and stay and watch, observe what's going on in the ground the way that a balloon like this can. So in that sense, I mean, it's part of, they have very sophisticated space-based assets as well. I mean, their space program is really, second only to our own. I mean, they've invested quite a great deal in that, both from, a military standpoint and certainly from a surveillance standpoint. So these balloons, I think, complement that.
Jonathan, do you think that this is a precursor that if they're doing this, they're wanting to see what our reactions may be? Because now I'm thinking about Taiwan. Normally, like a magician, if a magician wants you to look at this hand, what really all the action is in the other hand. So if he's doing something, meaning China's floating balloons, intelligence balloons over mainland United States, are they thinking about something going on in Taiwan?
Well, your question about observing our reactions, I think, is a very important one. And this is something that people have pointed out in the time since this has happened, that they do get to see the way that we react. I mean, how do our government agencies respond to this? How does our Congress respond to this? I mean, where do people stand on the issue? So in that sense, having the United States, being able to observe the United States responding to a crisis that they essentially created, or to a violation of our sovereignty that they created, is one that provides them with a sense of how we might respond to something else. So in that sense, I think it does have that effect, and it does give them a window into how we're looking at their actions right now. Though I imagine the real purpose of this is exactly what it is, which is to undertake global surveillance, and in this case on sensitive military sites, which matters a great deal because we already understand that they intend to massively increase the size of their nuclear arsenal. So if these surveillance assets are really looking at our sensitive sites in Montana and elsewhere, that's of great concern because the nuclear deterrence element is going to be very important in U.S.-China competition. I mean, you're talking about a country that, as you mentioned with regard to Taiwan, intends to carry out offensive military operations in the Pacific. I mean, they intend to use their military. They tell us that very, very clearly. Xi Jinping talks on a regular basis about preparing to fight and win wars. He's been saying that throughout his time as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. So, their military is built for that purpose. And whether it's Taiwan, whether it's the Himalayan border with India, whether it's in the South or East China Seas, I mean, there are many areas that they seek to use military force. I mean, all of this, there's still a chance, I believe, to preserve peace in the Pacific, but it will not come through engagement of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, with the economic availability of the United States and the might, but the problem would be companies, U.S. companies, mostly publicly traded, but some privately. I mean, I'm thinking of Nike, Apple, the NBA, Walt Disney and such. They are so closely intertwined with China because they want that 1.4 billion people of people to buy their products. Do you think that the problem that we're also having was that the U.S. companies are wanting to continue the status quo with China, where the U.S. government wants to more separate themselves from China?
Well, absolutely, Andre. I think that where we are is there's this deep contradiction, between U.S. national security and American business interests, and that's what has to be resolved for us to even get started on winning this contest. So I think that's something the American public needs to understand very clearly, is the business interests in China are ultimately, very harmful to our national security. And we've gone through this before in the Second World War, when many of our major corporations, from General Motors to Standard Oil to you name it, were all deeply invested in Nazi Germany. And ultimately, only when war broke out and their assets were seized did they become the arsenal of democracy and then play this very important role in American history, which I think, we still need our companies to play. I mean, our companies are, in many ways, the backbone of American economic power and economic superiority. But by the time they get so deep into the China market that they become, essentially beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, we have a major problem on our hands. So I think that Washington doesn't yet fully understand the importance of the corporate sector, the central role that the corporate sector is going to play in winning or losing this long-term contest with the Chinese Communist Party. And, in the meantime, on China's side, they've already gone through the process of deepening their hold over their own corporations. Many of them are state-owned, state-backed. The way that they've taken over their technology sector, I think, was disruptive to many Wall Street expectations. You look at the Didi Chuxing IPO or the fall of Alibaba into the hands of the Communist Party of China, essentially, to say nothing of the broader state-owned asset supervision commission companies, which comprise really the bulk of the corporate sector in China, or a great deal of the big strategic industries. All of these are ultimately going to wind up, and they already have, in China's civil-military fusion initiative. So civil-military fusion, which seeks to take civilian industry and civilian innovation and translate it into military power. I mean, this is something that's not just happening in the tech sector, but also across shipping, rail, aerospace. I mean, they're using all of that. They're, for instance, with regard to Taiwan, it would be, they'd most likely be using their civilian shipping fleet, and that's part of the civil-military fusion initiatives.
What
so
about,
for
Jonathan,
us,
go ahead. I was thinking about their favored nation status. Right now, we're talking economics. Well, China has a leg up with their favored. Do you think the status of favored nation should be taken away because of the events that's been occurring?
Well, I think Congress is already beginning to look at most favored nation status. I mean, I think it is something that, when we brought them into the WTO and, also when we conferred the special trading relationship with them, there was a time when there were very robust discussions in Congress about linking business and human rights. And ultimately, we chose business over human rights. And that was probably one of the biggest mistakes we made. There were forks in the road where we could have seen this more clearly and understood that what we're dealing with is still a totalitarian power that devastates the lives of its own citizens when it comes to normal rights and freedoms that we would expect in our country and really around many countries in the world. So that was something we should have kept front and center, and we didn't. We let that go. Today, I think now that it's not only the issue of values, human rights, but it's also national security and it's economic security. I mean, it's this bigger issue of having engaged this power that sought to supplant us, and now it's actually become a place that's capable of doing that in many ways. So, I think looking at the trading relationship, I mean, that has to be a focus. In Congress, in the White House, but also realizing that this trading relationship, in many ways, we're going to have to do the work of securing critical supply chains, ensuring that we're not funding their strategic industries, and ensuring that we're not transferring technology into a hostile foreign country. And in this case, you just look at the response to the balloon incident, where already 6 Chinese companies have been sanctioned, put on the entities list by the U.S. government. I mean, these are all companies that work with the Chinese military. And China's retaliation against us, I mean, it's most likely that eventually they're going to be going after our own companies in their market. But, our CEOs and boards, I mean, they're grown-ups. They can do their homework on China risk. And for the boardroom to understand that China is not an opportunity, it is a major risk. And for shareholders to understand that companies are taking on revenue risk, asset risk, growth risk. I mean, if your growth story to Wall Street is that you're going to grow in China for in the opening decades of a new Cold War, I think that's crazy. And, we need, I think, shareholders in Wall Street to be much, much more savvy and hard on this issue. I mean, this is serious. To be pouring our companies over into a state that we're essentially engaged in global confrontation ultimately with, this is very dangerous. So I think we need our private sector to begin to pull back.
Are CEOs, Jonathan, do you think CEOs realize that you talk about supply chain? Many factories, and I'm thinking of Apple and Nike and many others, have their products made in China and then brought back to the United States. If China so wants to, they could slow down our supplies, and which would put a crimp into our economy. Do you think the CEOs of these companies are starting to realize this and maybe diversify into other parts of we'd love to have them in the United States, but because of economics, of labor cost and such, they may have to go to other areas of the world. But do you think that they're starting to diversify now?
Well, I think CEOs are in a tough spot on this because the ones that have really bitten fully into the idea of U.S.-China economic relations, I think they've taken on the kinds of risks that will be very hard to manage. And ultimately, there will be some companies that will not come out of this, in the same way. I mean, the Fortune 500 gets shaken up every decade or so, and who's on it and who's not. I mean, that's a changing list. And I think in this case, the companies that will drop off that list in the 2020s, a lot of it will be due to unmitigated China risk. And the other side of it is it's one thing to diversify your supply chain so that you can produce goods and sell them back to the United States. You can do that in another country. But many of these companies are, for instance, Apple, we've talked about, I mean, 19% of their revenue apparently comes from the People's Republic of China. So, that's a very different problem than if you're simply an exporter to the United States. And I think that's where this all went awry from the perspective of corporate strategy and risk, is that the idea that it's not only an industrial base from which you can supply the world, but it's also a market that you need to be in, and it's a market in which they're, how profitable they are is an interesting question. But certainly revenues are being generated in China. So to ultimately turn the corner and turn the page on these kinds of I think corporate strategies that will lead to an enormous, systems level of China risk. I mean, it's just concentrated across the corporate sector, and they're going to have to change course, but they're going to need shareholders to help them do that, because, for way too long, I think Wall Street has been saying, look, go and grow in China. And let's not forget, I mean, there's still all kinds of firms that are buying China stocks, and, we have China as a significant percentage of the MSCI emerging markets, even of the global ACWI. I mean, it's, these I think are going to be under review eventually by Congress as well. I mean, for us to be pouring money into our top adversary is a really problematic situation.
This new Congress just started the House Select Committee on China, and it's being chaired by Congressman Mike Gallagher out of Wisconsin. And they've never had this before. Do you think that now Congress has come to realize that they have to have a specific select committee to study the problems that China's creating?
Well, I think this Select Committee is an important development. I mean, it's going to be, I think, very important for Congress to have a focus on our primary strategic adversary, and for that to ultimately become a very robust conversation in which we move past admiring the problem and move into an action phase. I mean, what does the United States fundamentally need to do to form a new grand strategy to actually succeed in this competition with China? I mean, if Congress can focus on that in addition to raising awareness, for the American people on this issue, then it's going to be, I think, a very necessary and welcome effort.
What should we do about TikTok? You know, we were talking about private companies, we were talking about publicly traded companies a little while ago. Well, TikTok, according to China, is a publicly traded company, but we strongly feel that the Chinese, the CCP government, has strong influences in TikTok, and it's affecting a lot, especially like teenage girls, as well as also many other young people. What should we do about TikTok?
Right. I mean, TikTok has already been banned, I think, in a variety of different states and on government devices. So I think the risks are understood. I mean, the data collection, the relationship to the Chinese government seems to be pretty well understood. So it's something where, people really shouldn't be using an app that brings their data back to Beijing. What that would enable them to do is to create profiles on millions of Americans to understand their habits on a device that at this point is at the center of many people's lives. So it's definitely something that people shouldn't be using, and I think government is in the process of taking action on this, and ultimately, whether we get to a ban or whether we get to some sort of, at one point there was the question of whether or not a U.S. company would take over TikTok. I mean, these sorts of things. I think there are a few options that have potential here, but ultimately, the way that it is now, it certainly is a serious risk and shouldn't be used.
China has about 1.4, give or take, billion people. India has about almost that, 1.3 billion. China has nuclear weapons. India's got nuclear weapons. China's an economic powerhouse that's wanting to get stronger. India as well, too, is in the same way economically. How concerned should Xi Jinping and the CCP of China be of a country like India nipping at its tail?
China has always been very concerned about India. They fought a war in 1962 where China, won that war, and it was a real blow to India and a wake-up call for its own, need to prioritize defense. But at the time, many of their reasons for war had to do with the question of the threat that they believed India ultimately presented to them as the leading power in Asia. So this was how they looked at India, as a rising power even, 60 years ago. So today, I think they're very concerned about India as a potential counterweight, as a partner to the United States. But the real issue is that I think they're actually, China has been quite successful in India's own region to form trading relationships, all that essentially encircle India, whether in Nepal or Bangladesh, certainly Pakistan, all pieces of the Belt and Road, or in Sri Lanka or the Maldives. I mean, they've done quite a bit to project their own economic and military power into the Indian Ocean region. So they have a pretty clear strategy for India. I mean, they began their sort of period of the People's Republic of China considering India a friend, and then very quickly that turned into war in the Himalayas, and today they regard India as an adversary. So, and in the meantime, the U.S.-India relationship has the potential to be, certainly one of the most important in the world, if not the most important. I mean, how we come together around this issue of security and prosperity in Asia, that it ultimately remains in the hands of the democracies and not in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, those are going to be the central questions, in that region and really around the world. And the other thing, of course, is that India has this unfortunate partnership with Russia that goes back very far, all the way to Indian independence and the early decades, where they, ultimately formed a strategic sort of alliance with Russia in the Cold War. So, India has been very reticent to condemn Putin and his war in Ukraine, and this is, they need to choose a side, in my opinion. I mean, it's time for India to swing to the free world and let go of Moscow, and we're in a process of having a Russia-China axis form. I mean, that's been forming for quite some time now, and I think it's going to be very important that India gets on the right side, which is the side of the free world and the world's democracies.
Just recently, the Prime Minister of Japan was in the United States, and Japan has secured military aid for, which was like the first time since 1945. They're wanting to have build their navy and their armies, which is because of the threat of China going into Taiwan. Do you think your feelings are that Xi Jinping, while he's now secured his third term, do you think he's going to be now going, it's now or never, of going into Taiwan?
Well, I think we have to take this very, very seriously. I mean, he's said in very clear terms, that the wheel of history is rolling forward, and nothing can turn it back. Essentially, that the wheels of reunification are moving forward. I mean, he's made many, many threats towards the island, both real world with the sorties and naval exercises, and also the documents and speeches that they've issued that explain that they intend to seek reunification. So we have to take this seriously as the central flashpoint in the Pacific. We would have to be in a position to inflict mighty sanctions on them in the aftermath of that. I mean, much in the same way that I think the sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine.
When it comes to sanctions, sanctions are like an after effect and many of the sanctions are hurting Russia economically, but because they're not really at a will for elections, will sanctions be that harmful to China if something like this happens?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between attempting to change behavior and attempting to change capacity. And I think that we need to focus on capacity. I mean, the behavior of the People's Republic of China, I think at this point, is very known to the world. I mean, they're carrying out a genocide, undertaking what General H.R. McMaster called the largest military buildup, the largest peacetime military buildup in history. This is not a place that I think we have a great deal of influence over when it comes to their intentions and long-term planning. But what we can do is ensure that they are no longer a cornerstone of the world economy, that they're not able to expand their global reach through their own corporations, that they're not able to expand their coercion over other states, large and small, through economic engagement. I mean, that's the game that we have to be playing one way or the other. We do not want to be competing, in my view, with a rising or growing power. And let's not forget, they're still growing. I mean, most Wall Street banks expect them to grow at 4.5% to 5% this year. And, JP Morgan expects them to grow 4% for the rest of the 2020s. So that's the game we have to play, is to begin to box them in economically, to cut back their hold over certain strategic industries and trading relationships. And we have to do that one way or the other. And I imagine that would just come into full effect if they were to attack a neighbor, but otherwise it's something we're going to have to do slowly and gradually to reduce their influence.
The book is called The Decisive Decade by Dr. Jonathan Ward. Always a pleasure, Jonathan. I hope you come back and join us again.
Thank you, Andre. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, join me next week when my guest is going to be Lori Murray. Lori is the chief economist at the Conference Board, where we'll be discussing the debt crisis, the U.S. government's defaulting coming up in June, and much more. That's all next week. Well, that's our show for this Friday, March 3rd, 2023. My thanks to Jonathan Ward for joining us this evening, but especially want to thank you for allowing us into your homes tonight. Have a fun weekend with the ones you love and a productive week as well. I'll be here next week. Remember, if it's Friday, it's Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm André Laborde, and remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.